Have you ever looked in the mirror and wondered, is this really me? Or maybe you've been living a life that feels perfect on the outside, but inside, something's missing. The truth is, we all wear masks. Some of us for years. But what happens when you finally take it off? When you stop pretending and start living authentically? Stay with me, because today, we're about to uncover what happens when you take that first step into the truth of who you really are. Are you ready to find out? Mason had always lived a life of certainty, or so he thought. For the past 15 years, he had followed a routine, built a reputation, and followed the script that society, his family, and even his own expectations had laid out for him. From the outside, everything looked perfect. He had a solid job as a security supervisor in a refinery in Texas, a beautiful home in the suburbs with Jennifer, his wife of 12 years, and a routine that was as predictable as it was comfortable. It was a life of quiet stability, one that many would envy. But there was always a gnawing feeling inside, a sense that something wasn't quite right. Deep down, Mason knew that his life wasn't really his own. Sure, he had checked all the boxes, a steady job, a loving wife, a nice house. But was this really what he had chosen? Or had he simply accepted a path that was handed to him? The question lingered, but he shoved it aside, too afraid to face it, too afraid to break the illusion of control he had built. That was until Richard Mackenzie came into his life. Richard was the new coordinator of operations at the refinery. He was 42, sharp-witted, with a presence that seemed to command attention even when he said nothing. There was something about Richard that Mason couldn't ignore. It wasn't just his intelligence or the way he commanded respect. It was the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence that seemed to come from knowing exactly who he was. Richard was different from everyone Mason had ever met. His approach to life, to work, and to people was different. And for Mason, that was both unsettling and oddly magnetic. It started subtly with brief exchanges at work. Richard would ask for Mason's expertise on a report, or they'd meet to discuss safety protocols. But something in the way Richard spoke, his questions, his observations, began to penetrate the walls that Mason had carefully built around himself. Richard didn't just talk about the work. He asked about Mason's life, his choices, his values. And Mason, for the first time in a long time, felt seen. One evening, after a long day at the refinery, Mason found himself sitting across from Richard in the break room. They were sharing takeout Chinese food, talking about everything from work to books and even traveling. Mason was used to conversations that skimmed the surface. But with Richard, it was different. Richard had a way of making Mason feel like his life wasn't just a set of responsibilities. It was a story worth understanding. And as their conversation deepened, Mason found himself sharing more than he ever expected. He confessed that he wasn't sure whether his life was something he had actively chosen, or if he had simply been going through the motions. "Did you ever want something more, Mason?" Richard had asked, his voice low but steady. The question lingered in the air between them, and for the first time, Mason didn't have an immediate answer. He sat there in silence, the weight of Richard's words pressing down on him. Had he ever wanted something more? Was the life he was living really his own? It was a question that rattled him, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face the answer. But Richard's next words were the ones that changed everything. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving Mason's. "Sometimes, Mason, we live our lives like we're reading a script that someone else wrote. But what if that script is wrong? What if you could write your own story?" Mason's heart skipped a beat. No one had ever asked him such a direct, challenging question. Everyone in his life, his family, his friends, even Jennifer, had always accepted the life he was living. It had never occurred to him that he might be the one holding the pen. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had been living in a story that wasn't his own. In the days that followed, Mason found himself reflecting on everything Richard had said. It wasn't just about the job or his marriage. It was about everything. The life he had carefully crafted felt like a series of choices that were made for him, not by him. And now, here was Richard, someone who had the audacity to question everything Mason had built, and yet it didn't feel like an attack. It felt like a gift, a challenge to truly see himself for who he was, not who he had allowed others to believe he was. Mason couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had shifted. He started to notice the cracks in his perfect life. The routine he had once relied on now felt stifling. The conversations with Jennifer, once comfortable, now seemed distant and hollow. They had been married for over a decade, but the connection they once shared seemed to be fading. Mason couldn't ignore the growing emptiness inside him anymore. He realized that he had been living in a world of expectations, a world that never allowed him to truly be himself. It wasn't just his marriage that was affected. His work, too, seemed to lose its meaning. The refinery, which had once felt like his second home, now felt like a cage. The smell of fuel and metal, the buzz of machinery, the silent respect of his colleagues, none of it satisfied him anymore. His life had become a series of actions, a series of routines designed to keep the facade of control intact. But inside, he was breaking down. As the days turned into weeks, Mason found himself increasingly drawn to Richard. What had started as professional admiration began to feel like something deeper. Richard seemed to offer a kind of freedom that Mason had never experienced. He didn't judge, didn't conform to expectations. He simply was. Richard had no illusions about life. He was real, raw, and unapologetically himself. And Mason, for the first time in years, wanted that for himself. The turning point came one night, long after everyone else had left the refinery. Mason found himself standing in front of the door to Richard's apartment, hesitant, unsure of what he was doing. He had made excuses to be near Richard, finding reasons to stay late, lingering just a little longer. He told himself it was all for work, but deep down, he knew the truth. He was seeking something in Richard that he couldn't find in himself. He was seeking honesty, authenticity, and the courage to finally face the life he had been living. Mason had no idea what to expect when Richard opened the door. Richard, in his usual relaxed manner, invited him in. The apartment was minimalist, modern, and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaotic, noisy world Mason had come from. The silence between them felt heavier than it should have, but it was also filled with anticipation. Richard poured them both a drink, and as they sat down, he looked at Mason with those intense green eyes, as if searching for something within him. "I've been thinking about you a lot," Richard said softly. "About what you said the other night. About your life." Mason felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this conversation, but in that moment, something inside him snapped. The fear that had been holding him back for so long finally gave way. For the first time, Mason allowed himself to be vulnerable. He let go of the image of the man he thought he was supposed to be, and allowed Richard to see the real him. "I don't know what I want anymore, Richard," Mason admitted, his voice shaky. "I don't know who I am. I've been living a lie, pretending that I have it all together, but I don't, and I'm tired of pretending." Richard's response was simple, yet profound. "You don't have to pretend anymore, Mason. Not with me, not with anyone." It was in that moment that Mason realized something that would change his life forever. He had been living a life dictated by others, and he had allowed fear to keep him from truly living his truth. But now, he didn't have to pretend. He didn't have to play a part. He could finally be real. Mason wasn't sure where this path would lead, but for the first time in years he felt a sense of freedom, of possibility. And that was the turning point, the moment when he stopped living for others and started living for himself. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without pain, but it was real. And for the first time, Mason felt alive. Mason stood at a crossroads in his life. The path he had walked for the last 15 years, his. For the first time in years, Mason felt lost. There was this strange duality inside him. Part of him was terrified of what came next, while the other part felt this strange exhilaration at the thought of breaking free. But how? How could he let go of everything he had worked for? The life that everyone around him respected, the life that had become the definition of stability. Was it even possible to start over? Mason couldn't ignore the pull anymore. The pull that had started when Richard entered his life. The conversations that had begun with professional pleasantries but quickly turned into something more intimate, more real. The long nights spent together reviewing safety protocols, their voices low, the unspoken connection hanging between them. He had never experienced anything like it before, and it frightened him. As much as he had tried to resist it, Mason found himself drawn to Richard in ways he hadn't expected. At first, he told himself it was just admiration. Richard was confident, and yet Mason couldn't let go of the life he had built. He couldn't let go of Jennifer, the woman he had shared so many years with, the woman who had been a part of the predictable rhythm of his life. Jennifer wasn't just his wife. She was his anchor, his safe place in a world that often felt uncertain. But Mason could no longer pretend. The weight of his own lies was too much to bear. Jennifer was different. She had always been the one who kept things together. When things were... The more Mason thought about it, the more he realized that his marriage had become just another part of the life he had inherited. It wasn't her fault. She wasn't to blame for the fact that he hadn't been honest with himself. Jennifer loved him, and in her own way, she had been living a life of expectation too. The pressure to conform, to fulfill the role of the perfect husband, the perfect provider. It had affected them both. But now, Mason couldn't ignore the truth. He wasn't the man he thought he was, and neither was Jennifer. The hardest part, though, wasn't the growing distance between him and Jennifer. It was the reality that he was finally seeing himself, truly seeing himself for the first time in years, and he didn't know who he was anymore. Mason had spent so many years suppressing his feelings, hiding parts of himself that he was afraid. But what about Jennifer? What about the years they had shared? Could he really walk away from everything he had worked so hard to build? The guilt of betraying her, of shattering the life they had carefully created, gnawed at him every time he thought about it. But deep down, Mason knew that continuing to live a lie, continuing to pretend that everything was okay, would only make it worse. The tension inside him became unbearable, and then there was Richard. Richard was the key, the catalyst that had opened Mason's eyes to the truth he had been hiding from himself. Their growing connection was undeniable, but Mason was torn. Mason's inner conflict intensified. He tried to push Richard away, tried to bury his feelings beneath the weight of his responsibilities, but it wasn't working. The more he tried to bury them, the more they resurfaced. Richard wasn't just someone he worked with. He was someone who had awakened parts of Mason that he had long suppressed. The honesty in their conversations, the way Richard didn't judge him, but rather encouraged him to be honest with himself, it was everything Mason had been missing in his life. The tension between Mason's old life and the possibility of something new became unbearable. Mason's thoughts spiraled. He found himself spending more time with Richard, looking for reasons to be near him. It started with small things, checking safety reports, running unnecessary checks. But as the days went on, it became more than that. Mason started to need Richard's presence, not just for work, but for himself. He didn't understand it at first. Was this just a passing phase? Or was it something deeper? The connection he felt with Richard was undeniable, and it stirred something in Mason that he had long since buried. But the conflict was overwhelming. How could he love someone else when he was married to Jennifer? How could he break free from a life that was built on years of history and shared memories? Would Richard even accept him if he left everything behind? These questions echoed in Mason's mind, each one more painful than the last. And so he did what he had always done. He buried his feelings. He continued to play the role of the perfect husband, the perfect supervisor. But it was becoming harder and harder to breathe under the weight of it all. It was in these moments of doubt, these moments of inner conflict, that Mason began to realize something crucial. In order to be true to himself, he had to make a choice. He could no longer keep living in this space between who he was and who he thought he should be. There was no easy way out. The path ahead was uncertain, and the consequences of his decisions would be far-reaching. But one thing was clear. If he wanted to live authentically, he had to let go of the life he had built and step into the unknown. Mason knew that this was the hardest part. It wasn't about choosing between Jennifer and Richard. It was about choosing himself. It was about finally being honest with himself about who he was, what he wanted, and what he was willing to risk to live a life that was truly his own. The conflict was real. The pain was real. But the possibility of freedom was something Mason could no longer ignore. The question was no longer, what will others think? But, what do I want for myself? And that was a question he had been too afraid to answer for far too long. The air felt heavier now. Mason stood there, looking out of the window, watching the steady flow of cars on the highway. It was just another ordinary day on the outside. It wasn't just about choosing between two people, between Jennifer and Richard. It wasn't as simple as picking a new lover over an old life. This was about a deeper choice. It was about choosing to finally live as his true self, without the suffocating weight of everyone else's expectations. Mason had spent his entire life trying to be the man everyone wanted him to be. The dependable husband, the loyal employee, the respectable supervisor. But those roles, those labels, were never his. They were molds he had tried to fit into, believing that doing so would keep him safe, keep him respected. But all it had done was make him feel small, invisible to himself. Now he had the chance to live authentically. The confrontation with Jennifer was inevitable. He had been avoiding it for weeks, weeks of sleepless nights, of agonizing over what he had to say. He didn't want, so he did the hardest thing he'd ever done. He told her the truth, the whole truth. There were no excuses, no sugarcoating, just the raw honesty that he had been avoiding for so long. It was late, the house quiet, the night settling in around them. Jennifer had been waiting for him. He could see the anxiety in her eyes, the way she fidgeted with her coffee cup, as if she already knew something was wrong. But nothing could prepare her for what Mason had to say. Nothing could prepare him either. "Jennifer," he began, his voice shaky, "I haven't been honest with you, and I've been lying to myself too." His heart was pounding in his chest. He didn't know how to start, how to make her understand. How could he explain it? Jennifer's face remained calm, almost distant. She had always been the one to hold it together, and now Mason could feel the distance between them growing with every word he spoke. "I've been living a life that isn't mine," Mason continued, "and it's not fair to you or to me anymore." The words tumbled out, but they felt so heavy in the air. He watched as Jennifer's expression shifted as she processed what he was saying. There was no anger in her eyes. No, "I've been so focused on doing what I thought was the right thing, on making sure everything looked perfect," Mason said, his voice quieter now. "But I've neglected who I really am. I've neglected what I really want, and I can't keep living this way." Jennifer didn't interrupt him. She just sat there, listening. Mason felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he never had before. But as he spoke, he felt a strange sense of freedom. It was as though a weight had lifted off his shoulders, a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying until it was gone. "I don't know what comes next, Jennifer," Mason admitted, his voice trembling. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I can't keep living this lie. I'm sorry." For a long time there was silence between them. Jennifer didn't speak. She simply looked at him, her eyes searching, processing. Mason waited for her response, his heart beating faster as the minutes stretched on. Finally, Jennifer spoke. Her voice was soft, but it carried a deep sadness. "I knew something was wrong. I've known for a while. You've been here, but you haven't really been here." She paused, and Mason could hear the emotion in her voice. "I don't want to lose you, Mason. But I don't know who you are anymore. And I don't know if I can keep pretending either." Mason's heart shattered in that moment. He had hurt her. He had hurt the one person who had stood by him through everything. And yet, despite the pain, Mason knew that what he was doing was necessary. For both of them. For all of them. "I never wanted to hurt you, Jennifer," Mason said, his voice breaking. "I don't know what's next, but I can't keep lying. I'm sorry." It wasn't the end Mason had imagined. It wasn't a neat, tidy resolution, but it was the beginning of something real. Something authentic. The next part of Mason's journey was equally difficult, though in a different way. Leaving behind a life that he had carefully built, the life of predictability and expectations, wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to walk away from the familiar, even if that familiarity had started to suffocate him. But Mason knew that he couldn't grow if he stayed in a life that wasn't truly his. The hardest part was admitting that his relationship with Jennifer was over. It wasn't about loving her any less. It was about realizing that love had transformed into something else. It had become a routine, something that no longer felt genuine. And in that moment, Mason understood that living a half-life, living for someone else's expectations, wasn't living at all. It was just existing. As for Richard, things were different now. They both knew that something had changed between them, something had shifted. But Mason wasn't ready to dive into something new, not yet. He still had to figure out who he was. And in some ways, that meant taking a step back from everything, to give himself the time and space to truly discover who he was without the pressure of others around him. But even in that uncertainty, Mason felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that he could rebuild his life on his terms. Hope that he could find peace, not in perfection, but in authenticity. The fear that had once kept him trapped in a life of silence and lies was slowly starting to fade, replaced by the realization that he didn't need to have all the answers. The resolution wasn't a clear-cut path. There were no promises about what would happen with Jennifer or with Richard or even with his career. But Mason had learned something incredibly valuable. The most important thing wasn't where he was going. It was about being honest with himself and finding the courage to walk down that uncertain road. Mason had chosen himself. He had chosen to live his truth, no matter how messy or unclear that truth might be. And in that choice, he had found the freedom he had been longing for his entire life. Mason sat alone in his small apartment, the morning sun filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. The silence felt different now, peaceful, yet filled with the weight of the choices he had made. The life he had known, the life he had been so sure of, was no longer his. and of the weight that had been suffocating him for so long. The constant pressure to live up to expectations that weren't even his own had lifted. But that didn't mean it was easy. No, the journey to self-discovery is never simple. It's messy, it's raw, and it's filled with moments of doubt and fear. But in those moments, you start to see the truth that had been hidden behind layers of fear, behind all the roles he'd played, behind all the stories he'd told himself and others. Mason. And as he sat there in the quiet of his new space, he realized something profound. The emptiness, the uncertainty, the feeling of standing on the edge of a new chapter, was exactly where he needed to be. Because, for the first time, he wasn't pretending anymore. He wasn't living for anyone but himself. For years, Mason had hidden behind a mask, just as we all do at times. A mask that was made up of roles he thought he had to play. The responsible worker, the perfect husband, the respectable man. It wasn't that these roles weren't real parts of him. They were, but they weren't the whole of him. And that's the thing we often forget. We are not just the roles we play. There is so much more to us than what others see. And in that realization, there is both fear and liberation. Jennifer had always been a part of Mason's story. But it wasn't just about Jennifer. It wasn't just about choosing between her and Richard, between the life he had built and the one he was discovering. It was about Mason himself, about coming to terms with who he was, because in the end, that was the most important part. Mason needed to find himself before he could be anything else to anyone. It wasn't about choosing one person over another. It was about choosing to be the person he was meant to be. And while that journey was still far from complete, Mason was beginning to understand something essential. True freedom comes from living your truth. And that truth is not always easy to face. It's not always pretty or neat. It doesn't come with a bow or a clear roadmap. It's messy, confusing, and sometimes downright scary. But it's real. And in a world that often pressures us to conform, to live up to ideals that don't reflect who we truly are, the act of being real, is the most radical thing we can do. Mason knew there would be challenges ahead. The path wasn't going to be smooth, and the repercussions of his choices would continue to ripple through his life. There would be moments of doubt, moments of longing for the comfort of the past. And yet, for the first time, he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. There's something beautifully liberating about choosing to walk away from a life that's no longer yours. There's a power in choosing yourself, even when it's difficult. And while Mason's journey was just beginning, it was his journey to take. The next steps were still unclear. Would Mason and Richard build something together? Would Jennifer be able to heal, to move on, or even find her own truth? What would the future hold? Those were questions Mason didn't have answers to yet. But here's the thing. He didn't need to know the answers right now. What he needed, what we all need, is to be present in the moment. To take each step with the knowledge that we are living as authentically as we can. And in doing that, we can begin to rebuild ourselves, piece by piece, with a foundation that is true to who we really are. The thing about change, about breaking free, is that it's never a one-time thing. It's a series of small decisions, small moments of courage. Every day, Mason would have to choose again. He would have to continue stepping into his own truth, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it made him question everything he thought he knew. But that was the beauty of it. The freedom wasn't in having all the answers. It was in allowing himself to live in the questions, to live in the uncertainty, and to trust that in time, the path would reveal itself. And as Mason took that first step into his new life, he realized something that was both comforting and terrifying. This was just the beginning. The road ahead was unknown, but it was his to walk. Every choice he made, no matter how small, would move him closer to the person he was meant to be. And that, in itself, was enough. Mason wasn't living for anyone else anymore. He wasn't living to fulfill someone else's expectations. He was living for himself. And in that simple truth, he found something he had been searching for his entire life: peace. As he sat there, in the stillness of his new home, Mason felt the weight of the past begin to lift, bit by bit. It was still a heavy burden, guilt, fear, uncertainty, but it was his to carry now, on his own terms. And for the first time, that felt like freedom. So, Mason took a deep breath. He closed his eyes, letting the silence wash over him. There. Maybe the road ahead would be hard. Maybe it would be full of challenges, full of questions. But as Mason looked out the window once more, he realized that he had already taken the most important step. He had chosen to be real. And that was the most powerful decision of all. And as you sit here listening to this, maybe you too are standing at the edge of something new. Maybe you too are struggling with the weight of expectations, with the pull of a life that doesn't quite fit. Maybe you're ready to take that first step toward living your truth, even though it's uncertain, even though it's scary. If Mason's story resonates with you, if you feel like you, too, are ready to break free from the roles you've been playing, I want you to know that you're not alone. You have the power to choose yourself. You have the power to rewrite your story. And no matter where you are in your journey, just remember, it's never too late to start living for you. So take that step. Trust that the path will unfold, and most importantly, be true to who you really are, because that's where your freedom lies. As you listen to Mason's journey, it's hard not to wonder, what about why? What truths are you hiding from yourself? What parts of your life have you been afraid to confront? The path Mason took wasn't easy, leaving behind the life he thought he should live, facing the unknown, and finally choosing to live authentically. But here's the thing. You don't have to wait until you've hit rock bottom to make that choice. You have the power to change, to stop living for others, and to start living for why. If Mason's story spoke to you, if you found something in his journey that resonated with your own, it's time to take action. It's time to stop pretending, to stop living a life that's not truly yours. Hit that like button if this story inspired you, and subscribe to join this community of people who are ready to embrace their true selves, no matter where they are in their journey. Share your own story in the comments. Let's start a conversation. Remember, the hardest step is always the first one. But once you take it, the world opens up in ways you never imagined. So don't wait. Don't hide. Step into your truth, because you are worthy of living the life you were meant for.